Late night host Jimmy Kimmel is back on the air after taking the summer off. He's missed a lot. Kimmel says if you're not vaccinated, you shouldn't get a hospital ICU bed. But I'm not sure if Jimmy was being sincere because he wasn't crying. Anyway, it's just funny hearing someone say, "I see you," who nobody actually sees. Oh. Look, I don't want to suggest that Kimmel's show has become boring and predictable, but last night during the taping, people in the studio audience were changing the channel.
Imagine, if you will, Jimmy Kimmel, the affable, seemingly unshakable king of late-night television, comfortably minding his own business, perhaps cracking a few well-rehearsed dad jokes to his studio audience. Suddenly, without warning, Greg Gutfeld metaphorically parachutes into the brightly lit comedy arena, not with a friendly wave, but like a hyper-caffeinated raccoon nursing a deep-seated grudge and inexplicably wielding a microphone. Within mere seconds, the expected lighthearted late-night banter devolves into a brutal, almost surgical public dismemberment, executed entirely with razor-sharp punchlines and withering sarcasm. Gutfeld didn't just roast Jimmy Kimmel. He metaphorically launched him into a distant, inhospitable orbit, using pure, unadulterated sarcasm as the high-octane rocket fuel. Ever witnessed a clown car spontaneously catch fire in excruciating slow motion? Yeah, it was something strikingly similar to that, only, dare we say, significantly funnier and infinitely more uncomfortable for one of the parties involved. Stick around, because this roast, this verbal demolition derby, leaves undeniable emotional skid marks, and the target, Jimmy Kimmel, was left spinning in the comedic dust.
The worst part about this whole thing is that his presidency is ripe for mockery and ridicule and even gentle humor if you like him. I mean, just Hunter Biden alone, just in the recent stuff, I mean, you could go on forever. But Kimmel has abdicated his role of a comedian. He's now just a political hack. Which I'm grateful for, because then I get the turf to myself. I'm not a comedian, but I just filled the gap. That's why I'm beating him every night, because he sat there with that guy and basically he spoon-fed him like he was a dementia patient.
It all apparently started with one of those classic, almost throwaway moments where Greg Gutfeld, with his characteristic air of bemused detachment, looked up from his desk, glanced critically across the vast, often homogeneous, late-night television landscape, and wondered aloud with a perfectly timed pause for effect, is Jimmy Kimmel still pretending he's funny? And just like that, with that seemingly innocuous yet deeply loaded question, mainstream comedy, or at least one of its most prominent figures, found its newest and perhaps most deserving punching bag. You see, Greg Gutfeld possesses this unnerving, often infuriating to his targets, habit of noticing the glaringly obvious, the elephant in the room that everyone else is politely ignoring, and then, with a mischievous glint in his eye, saying it out loud, clearly and repeatedly. It's a dangerous game, to be sure, especially in an industry where ideological groupthink is frequently and tragically confused with genuine originality and intellectual courage.
Kimmel actually said in that thing that, you know, the people who voted for Trump, they just don't know what they've done. You know, they don't realize how badly they've hurt themselves. And so it's not a concern for others that you're seeing with this. It's an expression of ego, that they are smarter than all of these people. And as always, when you're a slave to your ego, it's always somebody else's fault, you know, and therefore they cannot see their own errors, their own mistakes. You know, if you are open up to being wrong, you're more than likely going to end up right once in a while. But these guys have been wrong for 8 years. They've been wrong for 8 years because they can't let go.
Kimmel, once the proud, unapologetic co-host of a gleefully lowbrow, beer-chugging, bikini-clad parade of unapologetic masculinity called The Man Show, now, in his current iteration, drapes himself in the soft, comforting velvet of woke monologues, and, with increasing frequency, tearful, emotionally charged lectures on the state of the nation. A man who once enthusiastically cheered on women enthusiastically jumping on trampolines for the amusement of a predominantly male audience now, rather incongruously, cries under the harsh glare of studio lights about the intricacies of climate policy and the moral failings of those who don't share his precise political viewpoints. The glow-up, as the kids might say. Or in this case, perhaps more accurately, the glitch. Greg Gutfeld didn't just offer a mild critique of Jimmy Kimmel's evolving comedic style. He metaphorically opened a full-blown industrial-strength sarcasm factory and unceremoniously placed Jimmy's entire legacy, his carefully constructed public persona, onto the rapidly accelerating conveyor belt, headed straight for the shredder.
Kimmel cries about cancel culture. Kennedy, in a recent interview, Jimmy Kimmel blames liberal cancel culture, of all things, and their perpetual manufactured outrage for helping get Trump reelected. He specifically talked about their attacks on comedians. Tonight, Jimmy Kimmel fought back tears while falsely claiming Donald Trump attacked LA firefighters, prompting the LA Fire Department to attach a hose to Jimmy's face.
While Kimmel often fumbles his way through cue cards laden with political commentary that sounds, to a discerning ear, like it was hastily written by a particularly earnest yet woefully uninformed 17-year-old AP government student desperately trying to impress his politically active crush, Gutfeld, in stark contrast, serves his comedy sharp, unfiltered, and with the delightful, almost surgical efficiency of a caffeine-fueled chainsaw tearing through soft pine. Kimmel's widely publicized and often mocked descent into the role of a moralizing, almost televangelist-like late-night preacher is less a legitimate career pivot and more of a nationwide collective eye roll, a shared moment of bewildered disbelief. Here, after all, is a guy who once, quite literally, made a comfortable living off fart jokes and juvenile pranks. Now, with a straight face, pretending to be the sole indispensable conscience of America. Meanwhile, Greg Gutfeld has been quietly, yet relentlessly, busy building a veritable comedy empire by daring to do the unthinkable in today's polarized media landscape. Actually, consistently being funny. It would almost be a sad, tragic tale of comedic decline if it weren't so profoundly, almost perversely entertaining to watch unfold.
For women, children, and for the hundreds of thousands of hard-working immigrants who cut his lawn.
It was a terrible night for women, for children, for the hundreds of thousands of hardworking immigrants who make this country go.
Gutfeld's takedown of Kimmel wasn't a fleeting single-line zinger, a quick jab forgotten moments later. Oh no, this was a full, multi-course buffet of unadulterated mockery, a veritable feast of comedic destruction. Imagine for a moment watching someone painstakingly, almost lovingly, inflate a large, brightly colored balloon, only to then, with a sudden, vicious stab, pop it with a pin made entirely of pure, unadulterated logic and glittering, diamond-hard sarcasm. That, in essence, is precisely what happened to Jimmy Kimmel's carefully cultivated on-air persona. It began, subtly at first, with Greg Gutfeld merely pointing out the glaring, almost blinding hypocrisy that practically bleeds from Kimmel's pores with every earnest, tear-filled monologue. The man whose early comedic stylings, if subjected to today's stringent purity tests, would get him canceled faster than you can angrily type Twitter mob, now, rather audaciously, parades around the late-night stage as if he single-handedly invented empathy, compassion, and moral righteousness. Gutfeld doesn't even need to say it directly, because the irony, the sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy, practically screams for itself, a silent, damning indictment.
Terrible night for everyone who voted against him, and guess what? It was a bad night for everyone who voted for him, too. You just don't realize it yet.
Oh. You know what? If I ever cry on TV, it'll be because Maroon 5 put out a new song. But that's it! You big Now,
Jimmy Kimmel's much-discussed rebranding journey, his carefully orchestrated transformation from edgy provocateur to sensitive moral arbiter, could, and perhaps should, be meticulously studied in university marketing courses, filed under the cautionary chapter heading, What Not to Do When You Used to Be Fun. As Gutfeld mercilessly laid into the former king of side-splitting, often boundary-pushing skits, you could almost feel the collective memory of the audience stirring, a dawning realization spreading through the viewership. Remember when Jimmy Kimmel had genuine energy, a sharp comedic edge, and something vaguely resembling originality? Now, Gutfeld seemed to argue with every cutting remark. He's become the human equivalent of lukewarm, unseasoned tofu. Bland, undeniably smug, and trying, with almost painful desperation, to convince everyone that he's actually good for you. A necessary part of a balanced comedic diet. Now, meanwhile, over on the Gutfeld show, things look and sound decidedly different. Like, for instance, people laughing. Genuinely, unapologetically, not because they're dutifully trying to signal their political alignment through carefully timed chuckles and nods, but because the jokes, a novel concept in some late-night circles, actually, physically, land. Greg Gutfeld has, over the years, evolved into the comedic equivalent of a highly effective, almost terrifyingly accurate predator drone. He doesn't just critique his targets, he vaporizes them, leaving behind nothing but a faint wisp of comedic smoke and the lingering echo of laughter. He took one long, appraising look at Kimmel's latest tear-soaked monologue and responded not with anger, not with outrage, but with a form of mockery so precise, so expertly targeted, it could arguably perform intricate brain surgery. It was the kind of withering ridicule that doesn't need to shout to be heard. It simply winks, knowingly, at the absurdity of it all. Because really, when someone begins their nightly show by openly crying about the dire state of the world, and then, mere moments later, ends with a limp, uninspired joke about a fleetingly trending hashtag. What more? Gutfeld seems to ask. Can you possibly do but laugh, long and hard, at the sheer, unadulterated ridiculousness of it all? And the ratings? Those cold, hard, undeniable arbiters of television success simply do not lie. While Jimmy Kimmel's viewership numbers reportedly continue to circle the drain, with all the tragic inevitability of the final, regrettable flush of an ill-advised late-night burrito, Greg Gutfeld has, against all odds, accomplished the seemingly impossible. He's made late-night television fun again, a destination for those seeking genuine laughter rather than predictable lectures. He strategically skipped the tired, Hollywood-approved formula of preach, laugh, cry, repeat, and instead, courageously, some might say recklessly, doubled down on what actually makes people tune in, night after night. Authentic, unapologetic humor. And sure, the coastal elite critics, the self-appointed guardians of comedic propriety, will undoubtedly say that Gutfeld's show isn't traditional late night. But maybe, just maybe, that's precisely the point. Traditional late night, in many instances, has become a lukewarm, unappetizing stew of snarky, predictable talking points, delivered with an air of weary resignation by men in expensive suits who, by all appearances, haven't told a genuinely funny original joke since sometime during the Obama administration.
But the killer phrase was at the end when Kimmel said, "You just don't realize it." Because you see, he's smarter than you, and he needs you to know that. And his ego can't bear that there's someone out there more famous and more influential than him. I got news for you, Kimmel. The last time
But the real
you
killer
mattered,
phrase,
Bruce Jenner
the one
still
that
had
seemed
a
to encapsulate Gutfeld's entire critique, was delivered with surgical precision at the end of a segment, when Gutfeld, paraphrasing Kimmel, said, "You just don't realize it." Because you see, Gutfeld explained with a knowing smirk, Kimmel operates from a position of inherent superiority. He's smarter than you. He's more enlightened than you, and he desperately, almost pathologically, needs you to know that. His fragile ego, Gutfeld implied, simply can't bear the thought that there's someone out there. Anyone out there, more famous, more influential, more culturally relevant than him. I got news for you, Kimmel. Gutfeld might as well have said directly to the camera, the last time you genuinely mattered, Bruce Jenner still had a different pronoun. Meanwhile, Gutfeld casually walks onto his set, drops a few unfiltered, often uncomfortable truth bombs, and, miracle of miracles, actually gets people laughing. Genuinely, heartily, laughing. It's almost, Gutfeld seems to suggest with a shrug, unfair. Greg didn't just dismantle Jimmy Kimmel's show, his comedic stylings, his on-air persona. He dug deep into the entire parasitic ecosystem that allows someone like Kimmel to not only survive, but to inexplicably thrive. passing off blatant virtue signaling as profound entertainment. He mercilessly poked fun at the obligatory, almost robotic Hollywood applause breaks, the kind that erupt for even the most mediocre, uninspired of insights. He ridiculed with savage glee the increasingly prevalent idea that scolding your audience, lecturing them on their perceived moral failings, is somehow the same as genuinely connecting with them, fostering a sense of shared understanding or community. And, perhaps most importantly, he reminded everyone watching, with a stark and uncomfortable clarity, that comedy, true comedy, should never, ever come with a moral receipt, a checklist of approved opinions and virtuous stances.
Oh, I have a few names to add. CNN, MSNBC, CBS, the town crier. All outlets ignoring Biden's revolving door of gaffes, his constant forgetfulness, weird rambling speeches being let off stage. All the while you told us there's nothing to see here. Meanwhile, any parent can see this face means you gotta change a diaper.
Let's talk for a moment about Jimmy Kimmel's favorite and increasingly predictable pastime: hypocrisy. Oh, Jimmy, Jimmy, Jimmy. The man who once, not so long ago, gleefully built his entire reputation on edgy, often controversial bits, now recoils with theatrical horror at the very sight, the mere suggestion of a politically incorrect joke. It's like watching a formerly ferocious lion, now declawed and domesticated, earnestly lecturing the entire savannah on the profound moral benefits of adopting a strict vegan diet. You can practically hear Greg Gutfeld's incredulous inner monologue screaming, "So let me get this straight, Jimmy. You meticulously and very profitably made an entire career off objectifying women, trafficking in offensive sketches, and cultivating a frat boy energy so potent it could curdle milk. But now, suddenly, you're the self-appointed, unimpeachable guardian of decency and societal virtue? Cute. And there, in that glaring, undeniable contradiction, lies the very core of Gutfeld's devastating roast. Jimmy Kimmel, Gutfeld argues, doesn't even seem to believe himself anymore. He's not genuinely evolving, not authentically growing as a comedian or as a public figure. He's hiding, cowering behind a carefully constructed facade of scripted compassion and applause-ready, pre-packaged sadness. It's a performance, Gutfeld implies, within a performance. A hollow matryoshka doll of insincerity, all wrapped in the blandest, most unappetizing beige paper imaginable. Oh, I have a few names to add to the list of those who seem to be suffering from this affliction. Gutfeld might have mused. CNN, MSNBC, CBS. The entire town crier contingent of the mainstream media. All outlets that seem to be ignoring Biden's revolving door of gaffes. His constant forgetfulness, his weird, rambling speeches, his frequent need to be physically let off stage. All the while, they reassuringly told us, "There's nothing to see here, folks. Move along." Meanwhile, Gutfeld asserted, any parent can clearly see that the expression on Biden's face often means, "You got to change a diaper." Greg Gutfeld, however, is, by his own admission, profoundly allergic to beige. His comedy is a vibrant, unapologetic explosion of technicolor chaos, and he wears it not with shame, but like a hard-won badge of honor. He doesn't desperately try to impress the entrenched media elite. He doesn't anxiously audition for Twitter validation or seek the approval of the coastal tastemakers. He just, radical concept though it may be, makes jokes. Imagine that. In the year 2025, perhaps the most radical, most subversive thing you can possibly do on late-night television is actually, genuinely, try to be funny, to elicit laughter without a pre-approved political agenda.
Dana, I'll start with you. It was a terrible night for women. Trump won more women. He won the popular vote. What are these people moaning about?
I don't know. I mean, today Brian Stelter tweeted that there was a talent agent who told him that a lot of members of the media are questioning whether they have it in them to cover another Trump cycle. And then they wonder why the working class is like, guys, you are so out of touch with what real work is. And also, they didn't really cover the Biden administration. They didn't cover the border.
At this point, the comparison between the two hosts is downright, almost painfully embarrassing for one of them. One man, Kimmel, delivers a daily, somber TED Talk, awkwardly wrapped in a thin veneer of forced, uncomfortable laughter. The other, Gutfeld, offers a nightly comedy clinic, relentlessly fueled by pure, unadulterated irreverence and a healthy dose of unapologetic wit. Jimmy Kimmel's show, Gutfeld seems to suggest, is what happens when you foolishly let your overly cautious PR team write your punchlines. Greg Gutfeld's show, in stark contrast, is what happens when you blissfully stop caring entirely about whether or not you'll be invited to the next Met Gala. It's worth noting, and Gutfeld himself would likely be the first to point it out, that he never once needed Jimmy Kimmel to be physically present in the room to utterly, comprehensively destroy him. That perhaps is the subtle beauty, the understated genius of a monologue delivered with such clear, unwavering purpose. Gutfeld didn't debate Jimmy. He didn't directly respond to any specific joke or segment from Jimmy's show. He just, with chilling effectiveness, dismantled the very idea of Jimmy. The carefully constructed caricature of a late-night host who, at some point along the way, tragically swapped authentic humor for hollow sanctimony, and then, inexplicably, wondered why nobody, outside of his captive studio audience, was laughing anymore. And just when you thought Greg Gutfeld couldn't possibly crank the comedic heat any higher, he nonchalantly pulls out the metaphorical greatest hits collection of Jimmy Kimmel's entire career, also known in Gutfeldian parlance as the hypocrisy mixtape no one actually asked for, but everyone deep down desperately needed to hear. Gutfeld practically gift-wrapped this damning compilation with a giant sarcastic bow, delivering blow after devastating blow with the uncanny precision of a highly caffeinated and slightly unhinged surgeon expertly wielding a recently sharpened chainsaw. Because, as Gutfeld so gleefully reminded his viewers, nothing screams moral authority quite like a guy who once proudly hosted The Man Show, a program where women enthusiastically jumped on trampolines while he grunted appreciatively into a camera, now sanctimoniously wagging his disapproving finger at society, lecturing us all like he's the Dalai Lama recently reincarnated in an expensive blazer.
These fellows are experiencing deep mental pain. And it's not just them. Journalists are now offering tips to deal with their disappointment, frustration, even fear. And I get it. That's normal after any loss. I'm still mad about losing World's Sexiest Man to Johnny Depp. But why would people feel fear? Maybe because their only news sources are constantly telling them Trump's going to turn America into Germany. But you know who felt actual fear during the Biden administration? People who had to ride the subway.
Gutfeld, to be fair, didn't have to dig particularly far to unearth this comedic gold. Jimmy Kimmel's early career, by today's exacting standards, is an all-you-can-eat buffet of the very things he now, with such performative earnestness, publicly condemns. Crude, often offensive jokes? Check. Mocking, stereotypical accents? Check. Skits that have aged about as well as unrefrigerated week-old seafood? Triple check. And while Kimmel himself might understandably prefer that we all collectively forget those earlier, perhaps less enlightened, comedic stylings, Greg Gutfeld, with the meticulousness of a seasoned prosecutor, brought the receipts, laminated, alphabetized, and ready for public display. It's not every day, after all, that you get to watch someone earnestly pretend to be a beacon of decency and inclusivity after having produced a sketch where he controversially wore blackface to impersonate the basketball player Karl Malone. But hey, who's counting? Oh right, Gutfeld is, loudly, and with regularly scheduled commercial breaks. Then, of course, there's Jimmy Kimmel's now legendary, almost defining hobby, crying openly and often on national television. Nothing, it seems, says serious thought leader quite like sobbing uncontrollably, mid-monologue, over a complex piece of legislation he probably only skimmed the headlines of. Meanwhile, Gutfeld pointed out, Kimmel often brushes off actual, pressing societal rot with the limited emotional range of a guy reacting, with mild disinterest, to a lukewarm, slightly disappointing latte. Gutfeld wasted absolutely no time in shredding this glaring contradiction into fine comedic confetti. His signature burn on the matter? Kimmel cries more than my toddler during nap time, and frankly, with considerably less dignity. It was a line so cold, so brutally effective, it arguably gave Kimmel's already struggling ratings a severe case of frostbite. But Gutfeld, ever the comedic opportunist, wasn't nearly done. Because, as he so savagely yet accurately pointed out, Jimmy Kimmel is, in many ways, the comedy equivalent of a Prius equipped with a very loud megaphone. Quiet, undeniably smug, and ultimately pretty useless in a real high-stakes race. Translation: he's got all the performative sanctimony of a particularly earnest self-help podcast host, minus the actual tangible help. Or, crucially, the dedicated audience retention. Watching Jimmy Kimmel earnestly lecture America, Gutfeld implied, is like being aggressively yelled at by your dentist for not flossing regularly, all while they are simultaneously, and without a hint of irony, eating a sugary Twinkie right in front of you during your cleaning. Here's where Gutfeld truly, undeniably shines, though. It's not just in the relentless mockery, but in the meticulous, almost surgical method behind the comedic madness. He doesn't just throw lazy, uninspired insults or half-baked, poorly constructed jokes. No, Greg Gutfeld is the undisputed roastmaster general, a comedic maestro, specializing in exposing the glaringly obvious truths that everyone else is either too polite, too scared, or too canceled to actually say out loud. He doesn't punch down, as his critics often accuse him of doing. He punches through the carefully constructed charade, deep into the festering hypocrisy, and triumphantly out the other side, invariably holding a well-deserved martini in one hand and sporting a self-satisfied smirk on his face. That's precisely what makes Gutfeld so lethally effective and so infuriating to his targets. He thinks, he writes, he aims. It's not just hot air. It's a meticulously prepared 5-course burn, complete with a decadent dessert and a complimentary comedy toothpick. His takedowns land, not necessarily because they're mean-spirited, though they often are, but because they are, more often than not, uncomfortably, undeniably, right?
Or open up to being wrong, you're more than likely going to end up right once in a while. But these guys have been wrong for 8 years. They've been wrong for 8 years because they can't let go of their egos. It's true in the media. It's actually, it's true among the never Trumper Republicans. If you look at the sourpusses, it's an internal emotional feeling that why him, Trump, and not me? Whether it's like, I don't know, Bill Kristol or Jonah Goldberg. It's like, these are guys that were generally normal, and then their egos just kind of like.
Kimmel, on the other hand, often dolls out soft, predictable applause lines to his captive studio audience, like a slightly awkward dad desperately trying to be cool at the family Thanksgiving dinner. He has, in Gutfeld's estimation, become the human embodiment of a clap if you agree sign, a passive receptacle for pre-approved sentiments. Where Gutfeld makes you laugh, genuinely, and then pause to question the inherent absurdity of modern political discourse, Kimmel increasingly just makes you feel like you're trapped in a painfully long, mandatory school assembly, hosted by a well-meaning but ultimately ineffective guidance counselor who seems to have a lot of unresolved Twitter beef. Satire, when done right, slices clean, sharp, and deep. Satire, when done, woke, Gutfeld seems to argue, is just an HR-approved, thoroughly sanitized nap. And Greg Gutfeld? He's not napping. He's wide awake, thoroughly caffeinated, and gleefully roasting Jimmy Kimmel like a marshmallow that has developed an unfortunate and rather pronounced superiority complex. The public, it seems, noticed. Comments flooded social media, praising Gutfeld for finally saying what everyone, or at least a significant portion of the populace, was already thinking. But nobody on Kimmel's presumably well-paid writing team dared to even whisper aloud. Late-night television, many concluded, wasn't just boring. It was fundamentally broken. And Greg Gutfeld, armed with his signature wit and just enough unapologetic pettiness to be utterly charming, metaphorically walked in with the duct tape and a flamethrower, ready to rebuild, or at least to entertainingly demolish. And let's not, for even a fleeting moment, forget that while Jimmy Kimmel clutches his pearls and sobs dramatically into his expensive mahogany desk about the perilous state of the nation, Greg Gutfeld is casually, almost effortlessly, winning the brutal late-night ratings game, without pandering, without pretension, simply by showing up each night and being, well, funny. It's a novel, almost revolutionary concept in today's media landscape, apparently. The late-night television scene has, in recent years, become a veritable graveyard of punchlines that tragically died in development, of jokes that were too timid, too safe, too politically correct to ever truly land. Kimmel, in Gutfeld's biting caricature, strolls forlornly through this comedic cemetery, acting like a well-meaning grief counselor for jokes that never really had a fighting chance. Gutfeld, on the other hand, gleefully throws a raucous party on their tombstones, and he always brings a kazoo. Gutfeld's takedown wasn't just personal, aimed solely at Kimmel's perceived failings. It was structural, systemic. It pointed a harsh, unforgiving spotlight at everything that is arguably wrong with modern late-night television. The suffocating self-importance, the cynical use of studio audiences as mere props, the insidious idea that a celebrity delivering a heartfelt monologue is somehow a legitimate substitute for genuine civic discourse. It was the kind of sharp, insightful mockery that made you laugh, then made you think, and then, inevitably, made you laugh even harder at the sheer, unadulterated absurdity of it all.
Kimmel actually said in that thing that, the people who voted for Trump, they just don't know what they've done. They don't realize how badly they've hurt themselves. And so it's not a concern for others that you're seeing with this. It's an expression of ego, that they are smarter than all of these people. And as always, when you're a slave to your ego, it's always somebody else's fault, and therefore they cannot see their own errors, their own mistakes. If you are open up to being wrong, you're more than likely going to end up right once in a while. But these guys have been wrong for 8 years. They've been wrong for 8 years because they can't let go.
And then, of course, there's the final, almost unspoken jab. Jimmy Kimmel, by all appearances, doesn't even seem to genuinely enjoy being funny anymore. Every episode, every monologue, every strained attempt at humor feels less like a joyous comedic offering and more like a reluctantly served community service sentence for past, unspecified comedic sins. The jokes, when they do arrive, often feel obligatory, almost apologetic. The laughter from the studio audience often sounds strained, forced, almost desperate. The applause signs, one can only assume, must be working grueling overtime shifts. Greg Gutfeld, meanwhile, is clearly, undeniably having an absolute blast. He's the rebellious kid in the back of the class who quickly figured out that the substitute teacher isn't actually grading the homework, so he boldly writes a surprisingly catchy rap about the intricacies of the War of 1812, and still, somehow, aces the test. He's chaotic, he's clever, and most importantly, he's free. And that freedom, that unapologetic authenticity, Gutfeld seems to argue, is precisely what scares guys like Jimmy Kimmel the most. You can't script authenticity. You can't cue card genuine irreverence. So, no, there was no dramatic face-to-face confrontation, no fiery on-air debate, no direct response, no clapback from Jimmy Kimmel. Because frankly, after a takedown that thorough, that comprehensive, he couldn't really afford one. You can't effectively clap back when you've been so utterly, so masterfully turned into a walking, talking punchline. Greg Gutfeld didn't need Jimmy Kimmel to lose his cool, to engage in a messy public spat. He just needed him to keep doing exactly what he's been doing, with increasing predictability, for years. Pretending he's still culturally relevant, pretending his lectures are insightful, pretending his tears are spontaneous. The truth, as Gutfeld so effectively demonstrated, is that he destroyed Jimmy Kimmel not by outshouting him, but by simply being everything Kimmel arguably used to be. And then, significantly, some. Funny, bold, sharp, and utterly, refreshingly fearless. And he accomplished all of this without ever needing to raise his voice, without resorting to cheap theatrics. Because when the joke, the critique, the takedown hits that hard, that accurately, you don't need volume. You just need timing. And Greg Gutfeld's timing, as always, was impeccable. Just ask Jimmy Kimmel. Well, maybe not right now. He's probably still recovering from the roast that, in the eyes of many, ended his credibility faster than a prematurely canceled sitcom. By the end of that fateful week, Kimmel was, of course, still hosting his show, still dutifully reading his monologue from the teleprompter, and still bravely, almost pathetically, pretending the laughter wasn't echoing off the studio walls like the mournful cries in a haunted, abandoned comedy club. And Greg Gutfeld? He was, in all likelihood, already busy planning his next comedic conquest, probably over a very strong coffee and an even stronger, more potent sense of unapologetic humor. Because when your primary competition is earnestly giving TED Talks during what is supposed to be a comedy hour, all you really have to do to win, to utterly dominate, is tell a joke. Preferably one that doesn't come with a lengthy, unsolicited lecture and a heaping side of performative guilt. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is precisely how Greg Gutfeld, with surgical precision and comedic flair, masterfully turned Jimmy Kimmel from a once-reigning late-night host into a widely recognized and endlessly mocked daytime cautionary tale. No debate, no response, just carnage. Comedic, glorious, and undeniably memorable. Carnage,